And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. This is the second half of an interview that I'm doing with Kelvin Campbell, who is the author of Making Massive Small Change. Massive book, too. An amazing book. This is an incredible book, and it's very rare that I do two interviews with the same person or go a second hour, but it's worth it. I'm so excited about what Kelvin Campbell has to say. And we've been talking about top-down and bottom-up as it is dealt with in cities and urban planning. And there's so many things to talk about, but what you were just talking about was the need for creating starting conditions. And those are conditions that enable the kind of bottom-up potential of the people, of the communities to emerge, right?
That's right. I mean, what you effectively, you're the farmer. You're laying out the fields, and you're creating the furrows, and you're creating the conditions within which organic growth can happen. But in this instance, because it's organic, it's structured organic growth. And organic growth is something that is dependent on the needs of people. It's classically what we want all the time. So I often refer to the concept, these strange sort of parallel worlds that are like massive small. For me is a contradiction, massive and small together, but they tend to work with one another. So the concept of structured organic is another sort of concept that I talk about quite a lot in the book. So starter conditions are effectively sowing the seeds, laying out the fields, creating the furrows within which this growth can happen. And this growth is a natural process. You just need to irrigate it. You just need to make sure it's in the sun, and it happens. And that's probably the closest analogy I've had of the example. I think Peter Senge refers to it quite often. Peter Senge is from the MIT Sloan Business Schools, a very good management consultant, who said, as urban planners, we have to think more like biologists than as mechanics. So I'm kind of using my biology type analogy here.
Talk about structured organic.
Yeah. There's two ways of looking at it. Is that we kind of tend to go to the end state all the time. We tend to go as planners and as architects. We effectively want to impose our views directly on the end state. So quite often as a consultant, when I was appointed to do master plans for regenerating a town or a city, someone would say, what would it look like tell me what it looked like in 25 years. Tell me what it looked like. And you were effectively this kind of impresario posing this kind of idea of some sort of perfect future, knowing full well that as you lifted your pen from paper, it was out of date anyway. Okay, so the concept of a master plan, its life is as long as the pencil's on the paper. As you lift it, it changes. There's so many preconditions to make that change happen. So what I quite often refer to is how do you create an environment? In other words, how you stop from this idea of a command and control led planning system that focuses on an end state and uses complex policies to define that end state, to much more about how do you create the farming sort of analogy? How do you create the structured farm? Because a farm has fields. It is structured, it's laid out, it's ordered. The furrows represent the plots. The thing that turns it into the third dimension is the seed, what you put into it. But effectively, what happens afterwards is what people do. How do they curate it? How do they bring this to the next world? So, and for me, the natural growth process...
Wait. But you started a question, which kind of put in my mind, how do you shift from an end state focused, what's the alternative to an end state focused?
Complexity is highly dependent on its starter conditions. It's classically, if you use the butterfly effect analogy of the butterfly beating its wings downstream, creates a hurricane upstream, the classic old analogy of the butterfly effect.
Emergence.
So emergence classically is. So emergence or complexity, whatever position you take, it effectively is so dependent on its starter conditions. It's so dependent on the medium in which it starts. Okay, if it starts in a medium that allows it to flourish in a particular way, it'll grow in that particular way. So you can structure those initial conditions.
So wait. So I just want to kind of get this straight. So what you're saying is, the top-down way, the command and control way is the end state, focusing on the end state. This is what we want. The opposite, the bottom-up way, is to look at creating initial conditions to enable whatever possibility.
Whatever possibilities, yeah, whatever possibilities can occur. And through that process, through effectively manipulating those initial conditions, you can create different outcomes. And you can monitor and get feedback on those outcomes quite quickly. And that's what technology has given us the ability to do, to get rapid and continuous feedback.
But,
okay, this is working well, yeah.
But I can picture top-down thinking leaders, and that's most of them, being terrified by this idea, the open possibilities, not having a clear picture of, I mean, now I think what you're saying is the answer is to create some rules that define how this emergent growth happens.
That's it.
But
yeah,
talk about that. How do you make leaders who are accustomed to end state focused projects feel safe and trust this emergent initial conditions approach?
Okay, I mean, the first thing, interesting, Robert Kaplan did a report at Harvard Business School saying that 80% of all plans fail. So majority of top-down plans fail dismally. Peter Senge's got another one. Most strategic initiatives driven from the top fail at the outset. So there's a recognition that this kind of top-down view is not delivering the outcomes that a politician wants anyway. That politician wants to go and cut lots of bits of yellow tape. He wants to be recognized as success, is cutting that bit of yellow ribbon or yellow tape, opening a project. So effectively, that's the metric that most politicians would measure themselves as, am I being successful in it? The trouble is that everyone has comfort in the system. No one wants to buck the system. Our professions don't want to buck the system. Our professions are classed into the system because it creates the kind of level of confusion where they're necessary. Okay, so they needed to solve complex urban problems in their particular way. It's difficult for them to change because they're part of the system. So, I mean, to come back to the first point about focusing on initial conditions, it doesn't mean that you're allowing a total open-ended approach. You're providing structure, which is what you have to do when you plan. You're structuring the town. You're creating the order within which this town will start and grow and be phased. You're creating the small fields, in other words, the subdivisions, which enable individual actions to take place. So you've taken the big plot or the big site and you've broken it up into many small things. So
you
you've
refer
created
to grids. There's a lot in your book about grids.
Yeah, a grid. I mean, a grid is the only real urban model we have. I'm talking about urban model. And if you look at the history of settlements across the world, whether it's looking at the structure of Beijing to the structure of, say, Jaipur, or to some of the great American examples or the great UK examples as well, those cities that are focused on very simple, open, adaptive grid networks, and it doesn't imply a gridiron that marches across the entire city like New York does, although New York doesn't suffer because of that. New York is fantastic because of what it is. It doesn't suffer because it tends to be a uniform gridiron pattern. And most cities are collections of mini grids anyway, colliding grids. Something happens, a farm gets subdivided, and effectively a grid gets changed slightly, and it resolves itself. But the most important thing about using the analogy of the grid is the first starting point of order. And if you can create regular order, you create the first precondition for emergence. Okay, it's like the honeycomb. It's like the bee. The honeycomb has a six-sided, I think, whatever it is, hexagonal structure. It's built there so into which it can put its honey. It's creating an order within which it can start doing things. And exactly the same analogy applies to towns and cities. By creating the element of the subdivision as small as possible, okay, you create the order within which richness and variety and responsiveness can happen. People can't respond on big sites. They can respond on small individual sites, like the 6-meter townhouse project I mentioned in Berlin. 6 meters wide, enabled someone to do something which was 5 stories high, that accommodated 5 families, and it created the order within which this town started. And then many of these were developed, put next to one another, and that order was developed. So, for me, those preconditions have to be put in place anyway. The key question is, how rigid are you in that approach? How rigid? Now, I think I like the concept of balancing constraints. In other words, there's a very good complexity theorist called David Snowden.
I know
Who,
Dave.
you know David? Yeah, David writes a lot about the line in the sand, drawing a line in the sand, over which you can't step unless there's a good reason to step over that line. So it's a negotiable line. Now, you establish that line because you establish the boundaries into which you can create. Okay, but if someone says, "Hold on, that's silly. That line should shift slightly or move in this particular direction," and there's a good reason, he shifts it. So this idea that you're balancing the constraints all the time, you're constantly looking at saying, "Hold on, if it works better to try something this particular way," and therefore your conditions are constantly evolving. The preconditions you're putting in place are constantly evolving. The more regularity you can create, the more, and what will happen after time, they'll settle down to being the most regular. And that's exactly what happens when you look at the prehistory of some of the great cities of the world, how they evolve. And there's some fantastic examples in India, early Indian settlements, the early Chinese settlements, the early settlements that happened in South America based on simple plans that were sent out, or the Victorian towns where the standards plan was sent out from some sort of smoky room, sent out to the colonies to go and create a new town. These things weren't designed. They were just ordering devices dropped on the land. And I often said, I guarantee that the planner who laid out San Francisco never visited the site when they dropped the grid on San Francisco. And that's fantastic because of that. It's fantastic that someone dropped it and then nature kicked back. You know, the steepness of the slope created sort of scenes for car chases and Bullet and things like that. You know, that was the thing that created San Francisco as this incredible place, where the rigid order imposed on nature and nature kicked back and nature won to some degree.
So what you're saying is bottom up can work great with some minimal rigid restrictions.
That's it, minimal. And you manage those restrictions. You manage those restrictions all the time. If you see them working or working less or better, you say, well, let's try something different. It's almost coming back to the concept of the sound engineer at the concert. You're not going to flick something off. You're not going to switch off the violins halfway through the concert. You're going to say, they're a bit screechy. I'll move them down. I'll take them down a volume. Her voice is a bit, overshadowed by the bass at the moment. Let's take that up a bit slightly. So that's the question of constantly in this kind of feedback world that we can get. And you're managing in the presence all the time. You're getting this feedback. This is working. And people come along, a bunch of the innovators come along and say, hold on, guys, if we did something like this over here, or someone does something which is unpredictable, then you embrace that unpredictability. You say, hold on, there's someone's created a better solution for us. Let's learn from that. And then you incorporate that. It's a bit like a bug system, isn't it? Sorry, it's a bit like your beta version of your computer program that you buy. You buy version 9 or something. You never go and buy the beta version. You wait until 9.6 comes out before you download it on your computer, because someone's constantly testing it and saying there's a better way of doing it. And then, of course, new things happen and they get incorporated in the next version. That's what you want. You want this idea of a constant. And I use the example of twin tracking. In other words, this idea of parallel systems at work. So you don't switch off one system and start a new system. We never do that when we put a switch on our computers. We run a parallel system alongside it. You let someone else to go and get rid of the bugs, and then you effectively adopt it. So you effectively twin track these things. And then you move from one system, use the old system to test the new system, and then you evolve. So that's the best way of getting change. It's just effectively just step over to the new one until the new one has got all its bugs ironed out.
There's a saying that's attributed but not really completely supported that it was by him, but Buckminster Fuller said the way that you make change happen is to create a replacement for it.
That's it.
Yeah. Now
I think his quote. I use the quote as well. I think it's a very, very good quote. You don't try and kick against a system. You don't try and kick. You actually show that there's a better way of doing it, and then you use your better way to replace your older way.
Yeah. So you have a quote that I really like from Picasso: learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist.
That's it. The trouble is we don't learn the rules. We constantly think we're just artists, and we're not very good artists. That's the problem. So the idea that Picasso, it's a bit like Yeah, Picasso's quote is very apt. The problem is that we act like artists, but not very good artists all the time, without learning the rules. So this idea that you understand the constraints within which you can be creative, and that's that point about balancing constraints, so the innovators can actually take you to a next level. Innovation happens within a springboard. It doesn't happen from first principles. It happens from a point from which you move to the next level. And the classic example I use is, everyone thought that Apple invented, downloadable music, but they didn't. The MP3 and the MP4 system was invented long before, agreed by all the industry as the downloadable system. Apple just took it to the next level. So the springboard was MP3, which is an industry standard. When it comes to building cities, we don't have that equivalent of what an MP3 is. We go back to first principles all the time. We totally rely on the concept of the artist, who is free of rules. And therefore, you rely on the star architect, the big name, whatever it is, to say, this person will conceive a world that is far better than we would have ever imagined. Well, they never do. So the idea of having those rules and having that base level, that springboard of innovation, which is what simple rules give you, enables you to do something far better all the time.
Well, talk about simple rules versus complex rules.
Simple rules, firstly, must be understandable. And that's the most important thing. And they are generally negotiated. So simple rules is generally the outcome of a bottom-up activity where, assuming someone building an informal settlement on a steep slope has to negotiate with their neighbors about how they build them. Otherwise, their house collapses into the house below. So simple rules. So a normative way of dealing with it gets established quite quickly. Oh, look, guys, we've all worked on these things. If we're doing this, we need to shore up, we need to warn our neighbors, we need to do this. We have a simple set of rules to negotiate. And then, of course, we go on building. That's what we tend to do. So these things tend to get formed by, simple rules tend to be formed by bottom-up systems. A planner can't write a set of simple rules, but it can write the preconditions within which those simple rules are formed. I call them simple protocols. There's a different sort of thing. Protocols are much more instructional type things. And I often say that it would be far better if the planning system moved away from this fairly rigid, legalistic kind of framework that it operates in, into writing simple protocols like, I often use the example of like women's magazines, 10 tips for healthy nails or 6 ways to get a boyfriend or something. Simple ways in which you can understand how things work so that the lay person could understand what that meant and they could translate that back into writing their simple rules on the project. So you need this match protocols with simple rules. And that's what top-down systems can do. Top-down systems, once again, in writing those preconditions around simple protocols. And you can write those preconditions quite easily around responsiveness. In other words, we will do this, you can do that. Okay, so we will put up the party walls between houses so you infill them. Or we will lay out the plots so you can develop. Or we will lay out a street pattern so you can do that. So there's a transactional thing that's been set up. That's responsiveness. The other one could be around openness and adaptiveness, which you can write rules around how people are free to experiment, to learn through what they're doing. But you can also write in rules to say, if you're doing this, come and talk to us first. Talk to someone who's providing technical assistance or the building inspector, whatever it is. So we'll provide a simple set of protocols that enable you to be much more adaptive in what you're doing. And the third one is around collaboration. We will set up the rules so which we can collaborate together, which is one of our activating rules as well. How do you get people to work together? How do you band people together? Because once you band them together collectively, they behave differently than as individuals. They behave in a slightly more civic-minded, responsible kind of way.
Talk a little bit more about individual versus collective behaviors.
Yeah, I think individual behavior is very much in the self-interest. So suburbia creates individual behavior because it sets up a set of rules, building lines, in other words, for your boundaries. As long as you step away from that boundary and you follow a set of rules, you don't have at all. The rules tell you how to behave. Whereas in an urban condition, as soon as you bring proximity, as soon as you bring two things next to one another, you have to negotiate. You have to go and knock on your neighbor's door and say, I'm going to build next to you. I'm going to do this next to you. Can we work together? Please, warn me if I'm making too much noise. You build social capital through that first transaction. Then the neighbor says, Well, if you want to do that, I want to do this as well. Maybe we can do it together. We can, so all of a sudden a sharing thing starts coming out of the woodwork. So through that process of negotiation, through the simple rules that get formed on site, different things happen. The alternative is you write a set of complex rules, which is before you do this, you have to fill out 10 forms. You have to go to the council. You have to go and get permission to do this. You have to go and do that. You go and check this out. You have to go and follow this process, etc., etc. Okay. Achieving probably exactly the same outcome, because most people conform. Most people conform. So what we tend to do is we tend to sort of fall into the safety net of complex rules all the time, rather than allowing these simple rules to form. And I'm just saying those simple rules are natural processes. We shouldn't be scared of them.
Okay. We take a little break now for show ID. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up show, and I'm going to pause because we have it already for the video, so I just need to do it for the audio. My guest for this show is Kelvin Campbell. He's the author of Massive Small Change. He's an honorary professor at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. So we're talking about simple rules, complex rules, the collective, the individual. And I think one of the elements that are important in this is we want to get this way of thinking into the world more. We live in, I believe, a predominantly top-down culture, and the challenge is to get people to embrace these bottom-up collective ways of thinking. And I think one of the key ways that we can do that is with narratives and stories. Have you thought much about how to use that approach?
Yeah, the first book I put out was a little book called The Radical Incrementalist, which was 12 stories or 12 lessons from different parts of the world. And I try to tell the story through the lives of different people. It might have been an informal settler in Caracas in Venezuela dealing with a lighting problem. How does he get light shining on his children's books? To I called the cool co-producer, which was the sort of hipster from Krakow in Poland wanting to build a new cultural quarter around an old factory building, to a radical activist in Baltimore focusing on how do you reclaim some of the empty plots. So I took the 12 stories and I wove these into the latest book, Massive Small Change. So they sit there as sort of backstops to the book, located in different ways, and they all try to tell stories about people. In this instance, imaginary people set in real places, but based largely on real stories, but put together. So a collection of most of the stories I heard about were kind of put together, say 2 or 3 stories put together for effect. And they were intended to just communicate something incredibly complex in a very simple way. So narratives for me are incredibly important tools to try and communicate to people. And I use this a lot. I'm using this in the project we're doing at the moment, which is a fairly major spatial transformational project where we're writing through the lives of 10 different people. How would they engage with this project? And I'm writing it as if it's written 10 years from now. So Bob and his wife were downscaling from their big house. They wanted to live in this place. They wanted to live in a neighborhood that was closer to their friends, etc., etc. What did they do? And I tell the story. Or a young unmarried mother with 3 kids struggling in life. How does she get on the housing ladder? What is her first move? What's her second move, etc. So you can use narrative to weave characters into real life plots that enable you to almost, that's a classic way of writing a set of simple rules. So stories are probably the best way of writing those. This is how she translated. This is what she could do. And I think it's probably the easiest way of writing about the subject, which is so big, so complicated, and it's been made even more complicated by the systems that we have at work.
Wait a second. So what you're saying is you're working on a project now, a big project, and a major way that you're describing it is creating a story with 10 different characters on the way their lives will look in 10 years?
That's right. Yes, I find that's the easiest way of telling stories to people. So in other words, I can say, here's the plan. here's the road network, here's this, here's that. And they say, oh, that's very nice, but sorry, we don't really understand it, Kelvin. Thank you very much. But I'll say, if I can go back and say, and if I can write a story around a junior lecturer in this university town who wants to start his own business and has just got a young family and can't afford to make the first move in a house, but can't afford to get the first business startup space, etc., what would he do? And what did the top-down systems do to facilitate him? So what did the local authority, what did local business do, what did the university do, what did they do to facilitate his process? So I'm indirectly writing to the key players that can help him and say, this is the way in which you can help him. And for him to say, oh, that's good. I've got somewhere where I can get on that first rung on the economic ladder. I can create my business. Now I'm an activated citizen and I'm creating income. I'm going to employ local people. So what does he do next? How does he behave? So this idea, if you can write this through the eyes of changing behaviors. The one example I mentioned a bit earlier was, and it's very relevant to the project I'm working in, which is classically in informal settlements, the first solution is to stick up a high mast electric lighting to create safety and security, but it doesn't. It creates a concentration camp kind of effect. You can just imagine shacks with a 30-meter high mast lit at night, all night. It's classically the worst thing you could do. One of the stories I put in the Radical Incrementalist, incorporate in the book, is someone faced with that sort of problem where someone had said, the way we get rid of crime is to put light on the street. And he said, no, the way you get rid of crime is you shine a light on a book, okay? Because you take people out of that situation where they have to engage in crime. And so it's that sort of through the other side of the lens thinking all the time. Just if you look at it from the other side, and that's where I think the sustainability people have got it wrong, is they're focused on one side of the lens. They should have been saying, actually, there's a better world on the other side of this lens. Let's find this better world. And people will come to this world. Rather than saying, you have to do this, you have to behave in this particular way, which is classically what top-down do all the time. They tell you what to do. And you start saying, well, I actually don't really want to do that. I don't, or I'll tell you, I'm just going to ignore it. I want to do this. Or I don't care anymore. It's too complicated for me to deal with it. So, for me, the best way of doing a plan nowadays is to effectively write 10 stories of 10 different players or 20, it doesn't matter how many stories there are. But it just enables someone to say, okay, now I understand. How do I do it? I'm not really interested in what Kelvin says, how big a plot should be or what the nature of a grid should be. I want to know how I engage. So, what I'm doing is I'm building what I call the invisible chassis. It's that sort of structuring order within which people can come and play out their lives. And that enables them to move from the informal to the formal over time.
And so what you're talking about is rather than exact steps, you're talking about the nature of the interaction.
That's it. Because that's what a neighborhood is. A neighborhood is a set of individual actions.
Wait, you broke up. You broke up. The neighborhood is what?
The neighborhood is a set of interactions. It's a set of individual expressions of people's needs. So you'll come into a neighborhood and you will choose to do something. You'll either choose to do what anyone else does. In other words, I'm the normative person. I just want to build the same thing those other guys have built. Or I want to open my new bakery. Or I want to open a graphic design studio and I want to live on the top floor. I want to open a shop on the corner and I want to put my mother and her 2 friends up there. Or I want to create a little medical suite or something in this area. So those are all expressions of individual needs put together collectively to make up this complex organism. And then what happens? The baker closes. The baker all of a sudden has got an interesting shop into which something can happen. Oh, this is a great place for a jazz club now. It's got big spaces. So it's that coincidence. It's almost the second or third wave type thing that happens that introduces this idea of complexity in neighborhoods. And the best example you've got in America is Savannah in Georgia, which was laid out as this perfect top-down model of a community that was shipped out to go and occupy a grid square where the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, everyone was located within a grid square. This perfect utopian community was located from Plymouth or parts of the UK to go and occupy the swamp, which was a pretty dangerous place at one point in time. But if you go and look at Savannah now, each of those grid squares, or call them these collections of ward blocks, they call them, have all mutated to different qualities, where they all would have been the same. One's become the legal district, one's become the creative district, one's become the artisan district, become the people's district. So this place has kind of mutated over time. But what hasn't changed is the overall structure of the place and the subdivision of the place. In other words, it's just changed through different needs over time. So it's this classic cities just changing all the time. You know, I often refer to them as like pots of bubbling porridge. You know, there's bubbles happening in different places. And, you know, I don't know why, you know, was it that two lawyers happened to locate in one, and they said, well, it's two there, let's go and put three there or four there. And that became the legal district. So these things happen, and they happen when you create a responsive environment within which change can happen.
I love the concept of enabling emergence rather than trying to go towards an endpoint. Yet your story gives an endpoint. It gives us the 10 years later endpoint. How do you reconcile that?
You know what it is? It's scenario. You know, I still say that you can pose scenarios. You know, you can imagine. You know, I love the Gloria Steinem quote that planning is a form of dreaming.
Wait, you broke up. You broke up again. You love this Gloria Steinem quote is what?
I love the Gloria Steinem quote, which is planning is a form of dreaming. So that's what planning is. Future. So you can go back and project what might work out for someone. Where that works out that way. Okay.
You're breaking up again. Hold on a second. All right. Go from the Gloria Steinem quote.
Gloria Steinem had a wonderful quote where she said, planning is a form of dreaming. And that's what you effectively do as a planner. You try to imagine different futures. You pose different scenarios. They call it scenario planning, or there's design thinking. There's a range of different ways of looking at it. But effectively what you're doing is you're projecting what might happen, okay, to someone choosing the particular path. Where that happens that way, I strongly suspect it doesn't. But what you effectively do is you're posing a way in which someone can take a path. That's why I call it the way. It's a kind of a Zen thing in a funny way. The way in which you find yourself, the emergent finds itself to a different kind of place. And the preconditions enable you to get to that place. You're creating the order within which people can respond.
So I'm interested in a different kind of story. I think that our culture lives with the kind of hero's journey story that some superhero changes everything and rescues the world. And I've had conversations about, and I've talked to before about it, I think that we need to come up with a bottom-up story, a collective hero. And any thoughts about that?
Oh, absolutely. I talk about it all the time. I mean,
Go.
You faced with exactly the same crisis we have in the UK with your politics at the moment. This idea that a single hero will save the day. And the problem is we look for it all the time. We're constantly looking for the new Mandela or the new Gandhi or the new Martin Luther that's going to lead us to this new world. And it doesn't exist in a human anymore. You know, it's too difficult to impose this on a single individual. So I often think that I believe the way in politics should work, and I'm using kind of a massive small analogy. I think that actually it's the collective force of people where there isn't a single hero, where we go back to the concept of challenging our idea of a liberal democracy with a single leader or the two-party state into much more collection of people who share common values and common views. And they might choose to create coalitions of similar interests. And I think that's the challenge at the moment, because the two-party state model is not working anywhere in the world at the moment. That's the first thing. The single hero is letting us down dismally all the time, you know, to the point that it's more destructive to have a single hero than it is to have no government. So, you know, I look at the view by saying, actually, why don't we create a different order? If you go back to sort of the Council of Elders approach that might exist in other parts of the world, or the idea of the Senate, you know, governing in the collective interest of places, they behave differently to the. Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Start again at why don't we create a different order?
Yeah, why don't we create a different order? Why does it always have to focus on the single individual or the two-party state, which is pretty much driving most countries at the moment? This idea, if there's still two dominant parties with a set of other coalition partners that exist, into saying, let's rather go for a group of collective interests together, you know, where a group of people might say, well, I'm really concerned about climate change, I want to keep this, and let's form a coalition with another group of people who might be concerned with something else. But they're not locked into the single hero. They're not lumped into the single leader. So can you hear me? Because it was breaking up again.
That's fine.
Okay. Yeah.
Not breaking up, not going with the single leader.
Yeah, no, and for me is, why does it have to? It's quite interesting. I went to a lecture recently by Manuel Castells, who is an old hero of mine, a very left-wing economist who wrote a book called The Urban Question. And I went to a lecture with him recently where he was talking about the breakdown of liberal democracy, of how it's happening in most parts of the world now. It's not just Trump and Brexit. It's actually Brazilian politics. It's about what's happening in Hungary, what's happening in Germany. You've seen this shift all the time of politics towards a complete different kind of model. That's quite frightening, where it's incredibly populist. And I honestly believe this idea that if we focused on a group of people who came together with the right collection of interests, and effectively you manage this, and it wasn't based on a single individual, but rather a collective body of thought that drove it. You wouldn't require a single spokesperson, whether you would call them the prime minister or you call them the president. Doesn't matter what it is. You'd require a body of thinking. You might nominate someone to act as that spokesman on your behalf, but it was much more about a true democratic model, because we don't have democratic models anymore. They just don't work for us anymore.
I agree. Any more thought about politics and bottom up and top down?
Well, I want to create the massive small party. That's my idea. This idea that you can collectively get people to come together with a common vision. And I don't believe that any politician's giving us this kind of new vision of what an urban society would look like at the moment. You can't find it anywhere. Everyone's tinkering with edges around the old system at the moment. And I think we need a bottom-up swell of people saying there's a different way of doing it. It must be a different way of doing it. We need to liberate us. We need to liberate ourselves to think like that we can effectively influence. Because what I love about the American Constitution, it talks about by the people, for the people, and yet it's not. And most politics in the world are not like that at all. It's not by the people anymore, and it's certainly not for the people. And that certainly exists in most countries I can see at the moment. I can't see this idea of what government is there for, other than to stay in power. Because certainly not delivering on the ability of top down as a bad force. It's a force at the moment in most parts of the world.
It's a what force?
It's a negative force. Negative force. Government's a negative force in most parts of the world now. And as I said, your point about most top-down leaders will be frightened with what I'm saying, but actually in reality, 80% of the world is bottom-up anyway. Okay, that's where we're going for. United Nations Habitat projects that by 2025, 85% of all jobs that are created in the world will be in the informal sector anyway. And I put my son in that category. That he's classically one of the precariats who sits in part-time jobs, will never a mortgage, will never get access to a pension. There's that world which is completely different. They all sit in this kind of, I call it the informal world, but a wider definition of what we mean by informal.
Wait, you used the term to describe your
informality is, yes. There's a lovely description of this group of millennials who work on 2 or 3 jobs in the economy, and they might choose want and they choose lifestyle over jobs. An author, I believe I quote him in the book, refers to this group as the precariat. It's the precarious economy. He calls it the precariat, and it describes perfectly many of the kids I see today in a world where they're not going to get a job working from age of 18 to age 60 when they retire. They're not going to be in that world anyway. So the demographics are working against the concept of top-down anyway. So I keep on saying, why does top-down continue to behave the way it does? Why doesn't it recognize the changing complexities of demographics and economies? And if you have a look at most businesses at the moment, we're moving towards the big 5, which are much smaller, but they have a wealth of small networks around them. The classic Googlenomics kind of approach to what's happening around it, or the Amazon domination of society, where effectively what they're doing is they're spinning out thousands of small resellers around them.
They're creating platforms they're creating platforms that are using thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people.
That's it. Yeah, it's a shift. How do we move much more to platform thinking in politics, or platform thinking in social development?
But there are huge problems with platforms, and I think that we need to deal with those, and it's not working the way it is, the platform system. I mean, we have to democratize that and collectivize it so that Jeff Bezos is not controlling Amazon, and you don't have two or three people controlling Google. They're dangerous. They're rogue.
I think that's where the shift happens. Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I love the fact that New York effectively said we don't want Amazon to come here. I like that. I like that sort of thinking. So I mean, the problem is that it's classically big.
Wait! I want to hear about that, because there are a lot of critics who said that it was a bad decision to discourage Amazon from going to New York. So why, as an urban planner with a visionary model, why didn't you like Amazon going there?
Because Amazon is bigness. It's bigness personified, and Amazon by its definition will fail, because giantism is the first sign of failure. That's what history tells us. History tells us that giantism is the first sign of failure. What's interesting is how quickly certain platforms change, how quickly models change. Someone will come up with a new model in a short space of time and replace that with something different. I think that Amazon is kind of reaping its high points at the moment. It will change. It can't continue like this. Otherwise, there'll be a single platform to do retail in the entire world. That's what it is. If it's them and Alibaba, I think are the two dominant retail platforms. So I mean, the point is that how do you control bigness, and how do you so the point is, I think you have to. If Amazon is what it is, you have to democratize it. You're absolutely right. I think the interesting thing on New York rejecting it was more on principle than on the point that our main streets to be here, but it's killing the main streets and high streets anyway.
You broke up again. You asked the question how do you control bigness? I think that's a really important question. So why don't we go there with that? How do you control bigness? How do you control bigness?
I think you don't let it get there, because it's a natural process. I mean, that's the thing about capitalism. Capitalism, by its very nature, drives bigness. I mean, I sat through watching the movie Vice the other day, which was the most incredible movie I've seen in a long time, about how we got to where we got to based on the big players making decisions which are horrific decisions in the collective interest of majority of people in the world. But that's what happens. Once you open the door to bigness, it creeps in quite quickly. Someone said the other day, 80% of all transactions that happen in banks in the UK happen through 5 major banks. So 80% through 5 major banks. Just think of that control. Well, in reality, those banks can't fail. So government bails them out. That's what happens. So, the question is, you have to control. And that's what I think the role of government is to do, is to make sure that no one gets said, we used to have a thing called the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. And I often said, why was there only...
You broke up again. You were saying the role of government. What's the role of government?
The role of government is to make sure that nothing gets too big. I'm very much in sort of the Adam Smith view of thinking, that you want 1,000 bakers, because 1,000 bakers you don't want 1 or 2 bakers dominating the bread market. You really want this idea of, because that's actually where it's competition that creates this, at the very bottom level, that creates this stability in a system. 2 bakers create instability, because 2 bakers go and meet with one another and say, let's fix the price of bread now. We control the market. It's inevitable. It's an inevitable outcome of any system that does that, allows that to happen. We used to have in the UK, what was called the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. We don't have one anymore. And I often said, why was there only one Monopolies and Mergers Commission? There should have been hundreds of Monopolies and Mergers Commission. We should never have allowed our housing industry to become as centralized, our food industry to become so centralized, our banking industry to become so centralized. Yet we are. And your point, coming back to it, is that the left wing and the right wing, to some degree, want the same things. They want control. And both of them have a vested interest in bigness, but profess to want it local. And it's quite a difficult thing for these two parties to shift their views.
Yeah, I agree with you. Vested interest in bigness. Talk more about that. How do both parties have a vested interest in bigness?
Well, if the right has a vested interest in business, okay, which is big, generally big, because the big guys are the ones lobbying all the time, for the status quo or for changes to the status quo, and the left wing is controlling the trade unions, which are big, So both of them are controlling big forces, and by definition, that both of them are promoting bigness. In other words, our strength in the trade union is that we're big and we can take on. So these two forces play against one another all the time. You constantly getting this between bigness at different levels. So the real question is, if you broke the big private into many smalls, by definition, you probably wouldn't need the big trade unions to operate at that level. They could become many smalls as well. They could be operating like, say, fantastic example of northern Italy at one point in time, where hundreds of small banks were funding hundreds of small businesses, building hundreds of different things, whether they were building shoes or chairs, whatever it is. It was the most distributed system imaginable, which has now all become centralized, as someone's been buying up the shoe companies or buying up the furniture companies. So this idea that you can run this thing as a distributed network of small individual things. I use Leopold Kohr. I don't know if you know Leopold Kohr's work, The Breakdown of Nations. Very, very good reading material. He wrote the book Breakdown of Nations in the 1920s. He was an economist who worked in Puerto Rico, where he said the problem about bigness is bigness itself. And he was predicting the breakdown of Europe as a big organism. He said Europe will become big and then Europe will break down again into smaller things. So this idea that there's an inevitable process of decay that happens when you hit a point of bigness. You hit a point and then all of a sudden it decays back to something smaller. And these are just natural processes. They're natural cycles that happen. So, I think that if you look at, say, politics at the moment, whether it's left or right politics, they're both suffering from exactly the same problems. They're both suffering from bigness. Therefore, the engagement is really about how we power and how do we maintain the bigness of our friends. Okay, how do we keep our friends big as well? Because they keep us in power.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think I've written a lot about bigness over the years, and I think that, like you said, we have to prevent it. One thing that I've been writing about for 8 years is we have to make it illegal to be a billionaire because there's too much power there. And another thing is I think we have to make it more difficult and not worth it to merge and to acquire and to take small businesses and turn them into parts of a bigger business. I mean, this is, to me, concrete ways that you can prevent more bigness.
That's it. There used to be rules to do that. You used to have to go to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission and say, can I consolidate 2 food stores into one? And they used to say years ago, no, you can't. It's unfair competition. They used to do it. They don't do it anymore. So, we've kind of lost that. We've lost that lever, that critical lever. But I think for me, it's much more a moral thing. It's much more. I think we as users or consumers can effectively take action. We can actually say, well, we'll buy more locally. We'll choose not to go and buy at that food store. We'll choose not to do that. So we have the power to do it. So this thing about by the people, for the people, we have that ability to mobilize to say, we don't want this to happen anymore. And, the idea that we're going to get a new government that's going to tell us that, hold on, guys, all of a sudden, small is beautiful. We want small now is a myth. It's not going to happen. If we're looking for leadership from top down at the moment, we're not going to find it. We're only going to find it through citizen action. We're only going to find it from bottom up. And we have that power to say to that food store, you've gone and consolidated and gobbled up someone, we're not going to buy from you. Okay? We're not going to buy from you. And we're going to rather focus on independence. We're going to focus on buying locally. We're going to focus on maybe traveling less. We're going to do this. So we have that ability. We have to be liberated ourselves in this system. We are trapped in the system as much as everyone else is trapped in it.
It's hard to do, though. I mean, last night, Elizabeth Warren talked about how one of the big problems with Amazon is they have all the data, so they can see if a product is doing really well. And once they see that it's doing well enough, they start making their own version of it. They knock it off and they get rid of the small business that's making that product, and then they start making it. And the user, I mean, the buyer is going to look and go, oh, well, Amazon's got this same product and they're charging 10% less and it's free shipping. I'll go with them. Cool. And that's a hard thing to deal with.
It is a hard thing to do, but the question is, so where do we go? Do we go to the end of the branch with Amazon until it falls off? Okay. Where do we go to? Do we just chase the buck all the time? Is that our only metric that we use, which is cheapness? Okay, or efficiency? I mean, I know how efficient it is. I know I can order at Amazon before 10 o'clock in the morning and it'll be delivered that same day now. I know that they're starting to deliver drones near us, so that's what they'll do. They'll start doing it. So the question is, how do we change that? How do we change that? We can only change it ourselves. Sorry?
How?
We can only change it. Yeah. So it's, to me, I think it's much more about, what's happened recently in Brexit, which is quite fascinating, is firstly, the confusion that has existed around the sort of concept of leaving the place which is our primary trading partner, to a lot of people seeing this as in a completely different way to the way the politicians see it. And all of a sudden, a million people going out in the street and protesting and saying, so we don't want it to happen, or we want a different version of this to happen. You're starting to see citizen action taking place all the time. The question is, how do you scale it up to the point that it represents more than just those politicians who want to stay in power? Now, I'm not saying that you have to have an Arab Spring every time you want to change a policy, but there must be a point that exists, say, in Germany, in Berlin, where constructive activism, when I use the word construct, not destructive active, constructive activism, which is, let's find a different and a better way. So we're going to go there and oppose to the mayor of our town or city that here is a better way of doing it. And it will achieve the following. Let's go and try it. Let's go and try it. And I think that's what we're going to be doing. There'll be a point in time where Amazon will control everything if we let it. It's a natural outcome. There's no incentive for them to stop controlling everything unless someone stops it, unless someone says there's a different way of doing it. But I mean, I think it's part of those choices we have to make at the moment, as citizens, because I think the thing is, how do we take back the concept of, by the people, for the people? How do we come back to that idea, that fundamental starting point of a constitution, which exists in some intent in most constitutions in the world, and yet it's not been delivered on.
So what are the small steps, the incremental steps that we can start doing to take that back?
I think starting as local as you can, hyper local as far as I'm concerned, and effectively trying to build up this thing to the point that all of a sudden you've got a coalition of 20 locals that add up to something bigger than, that's my sort of cartoon I use on Massive Small, is that if you can harness all those fishes to add up to a much bigger fish than the biggest fish that's out there, you become a very powerful force. And it only requires organization, or it requires a common set of values or common purpose. And the problem is we're not expressing this common purpose anymore. We're not expressing there's no real debate. The last time a real debate happened that I saw was in Scotland around the Scottish referendum, where there were kids meeting every night at bars and restaurants or schools or universities, talking about what kind of society they want. And as a result, they had an 86% poll in the country. Okay. Someone told me the other day that the mayor of Los Angeles was voted in on a 4% poll. I don't know if that's right, but I wouldn't be surprised. So this idea that the apathy has crept into the system. So how do you mobilize that? How do you mobilize active citizenship in a world where a lot of people will say, well, I paid my taxes so government could do this for me? Well, the 25% could say, I'm comfortable in my authoritarian zone or my authoritarian world. The point is that it's not going to be them that's going to make that change anyway. It requires enough people, enough of those early adopters to make that shift. Yeah. The yellow vests in France at the moment, the Brexit demonstrations happening. I don't know where you find that expression in other parts of the world, but you're seeing it increasingly happen. The trouble is, it's not hitting a tipping point yet. And maybe the real discussion we need to have worldwide is actually, what sort of society do we want to live in? Let's talk about it. Because someone defined it somewhere 3 or 4 decades ago. It might have been Truman, or it might have been FDR, or it might have been someone in another part of the world that we kind of took and said, well, that's the kind of values we think are important. But we haven't spoken about this again. We haven't spoken about this again.
So with all the thought you've given about your approach to changing urban planning, changing cities, what kind of society do you want to live in?
Equitable, fair, easy access to opportunity for all. Quite highbrow, romantic sort of ideas of what a society should be. A place that feels friendly and happy, and it's burning with collective will to do the right thing. To act together, to work together in the collective interest of a place. I mean, that to me is what I see as the fundamental calling of any urbanist. All those things and more. Specialness, uniqueness, vibrancy, buzz. I don't know, all these kind of words. They're all around. If you trawl them out, they all sound sort of superficial, but they all collectively add up to the kind of place we probably all want to live in. Kind of place where you feel like you belong. You feel like you're part of something. It doesn't matter what the composition of that place is, but you all feel you're together. You all feel that you're part of the same thing.
And what's keeping us from having that?
Our own limitations, our own inhibitions. We can sit and blame politicians till the cows come home. We can actually say, so we put them there. We gave them the mandate to act for us. The inhibitions are in us, thinking about what we want to do. But we all find it too difficult. We all find it too difficult to kind of deal with, and therefore we kind of bury our heads. Or we say, politicians typically, we can blame them. Everyone blames everyone else. But I'm saying at the moment, in the same way as I look at my own professions, the urban professions, and I blame them for the situation we're in, because they are riding on the backs of the system. In other words, they're not there as agents of change, they're agents of the status quo. Okay, and it's very difficult to change a status quo when your business is set up to do things in a particular way. It's very difficult. I had to step outside of consultancy. I had to literally say to myself, I cannot do that kind of work anymore. I have to step out and look at it through the other side of the lens and tell the story.
So what's the alternative to consultancy? What did you do instead?
Well, generally, you would be either working for the public sector or the private sector. And the public sector increasingly devolved itself where it was only using the private sector. So your main route, if you wanted to become an urbanist, would probably be a consultant. It would probably be the point where you could at least make some sort of inroads into what you were doing. And I think that bred another set of problems. It bred another set of relationships. It bred another set of conditions where you were part of the system then. You didn't want to challenge the status quo because the next job depended on you behaving in a normative system-based kind of way. So it's difficult. There was a wonderful quote that Russell Brand, who put a book out, I forgot what it was called again, I think it was called Revolution, but it was a play on the word love, said, the only people who believe the system works work for the system. Or those who believe the system works for the system. And that's absolutely right. If you challenge most people, they'll say, sorry, it's not working. But if you challenge those people who are in the system, they'll say it works. Difficult for them to change. Yeah. There's no incentive for it to change, unless there's a bigger force at work, unless there's a groundswell of an active will to make a change. I'd like to think that we what's happening in the States and what's happening in the UK at the moment in terms of our politics, I like to think that we're coming to the end of a branch. We're coming to the end of a point. The Trumps and the Brexits will fall off that branch, and something new will emerge. Something new will emerge. You're starting to see political parties shifting. You're starting to see different formations happening. This is what sees the chance. For me, I look at it by saying, is this an end? Is this about paradigm shift finally happening? And are we equipped to deal with that paradigm shift? And how do we mobilize to say, okay, guys, this didn't work. This sort of experiment in liberal democracy we've had for X decades is not working anymore. What are we going to do about it now? What are we going to try now? Or are we just going to continue doing it in the same way? And you're going to end up with another single hero, over-promising and under-delivering and lying.
You mentioned twice the idea of coming to the end of the branch. Yes. What do you mean by that?
I'm just using tipping point as a sort of another analogy. We've come to that point where something has got to the end of its line, and it can't do anything more than fall off. It's the end of that linear approach that we've been following for years. And are we at the new renaissance, the new point? I'd like to think that we could be at that point, because I think there's enough dissatisfaction worldwide with our top-down systems to think that there might be a different way of a different process that might emerge, or a different system that could emerge. But it does require more people thinking like us, I'd imagine. It doesn't require us writing books that and hopefully people read them. It requires getting out there and talking more. I mean, I'm finding increasingly what I'm doing now is not really selling the book, but actually getting out and working on projects and saying, through this project, I can show, okay, guys, this is working. We've tried something different. This is working. Let's learn from it. Let's learn. So I've kind of gone back into kind of a public sector kind of creature, acting as a thought leader and a disruptor on this major project, and saying there must be different ways of thinking. Must be different ways.
And how are the leaders responding to you?
Well, I think increasingly leaders are saying, well, show us the way, show us the way. Rather than saying, tell us we must change, they're saying secretly now, show us the way, show us how we can do it. Because we're sitting with an international housing crisis. Every country in the world has this crisis at the moment. We're all faced with exactly the same sort of challenges. We're facing with increasing decay of cities, we're increasing changes in economies, rapidly changing economies. We can't predict anymore. And most of the guys are saying, actually, we can't use our old tools anymore. We can't use those things that kept us going for 4 or 5 decades or something. We need to think of different ways of doing it now. But we don't know what to do. So, that's what I'm probably saying the same thing. I'm probably saying, I don't have all the answers, okay? But actually, the best way we're going to find those answers is to try something different. And what is the risk? The one risk is nothing happens, okay? Or it continues to happen in the way it's happening at the moment, which is continual failure. Or let's try something different.
And you're suggesting a bottom-up, massive, small approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we need a wrap.
Yeah.
Good place to end.
Thank you very much.
Any last words? Any last words?
No, I just think, we need people like yourselves and ourselves to come together and sort of reinforce what it is we say and do. Because there's incredibly good minds out there thinking around the subject. And we need to communicate it to the people at the top. That's what our challenge is to get it to places where people are listening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Kelvin Campbell is the author of Massive Small Change. He is the honorary professor at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. Thanks so much, Kelvin.
Thanks, Rob.